The demand arrived over the Pacific at what humans would later remember as mid-afternoon, though no clock time could fully capture the instant everything shifted. On every major screen in orbit and on the ground, a cold blue icon blossomed, a stylized sigil like a chained star. Communications satellites buckled under the incoming data. Oceanside crowds who had been watching quiet weather feeds suddenly found themselves staring into the eyes of something vast and robed in light. Arch-Exactor Drelmok of the Thulcor Dominion regarded Earth through an array of sensor facets that translated muddy human clouds and continents into categorized threat levels. To the humans watching, he looked like a towering insectile priest wrapped in layers of digitized stone, his chiton hidden beneath shimmering legal script. His voice arrived in every language at once, filtered, precise, and already defined as evidence. By mandate of the Thulcor Dominion, under the auspices of the Xerthi Conclave, by authority drawn from the Codex Axiomata, polity designation, Terran Accord is hereby notified of its status as unreckoned. To avert rectifying purgation, you will provide, within one standard cycle, 1,000 living human souls for ritual balancing before the orbital Basilica of Tsekra. Around Earth, air traffic controllers froze, commuters stared upward, and in a conference chamber beneath Nairobi's extended skyline, Raoul Igbendayan's pulse spiked once and then steadied. He had expected contact someday. He had not expected contact like this. The chamber dimmed as the feed focused on the figure in blue spectral robes. Raoul stood at the center of the curved table, surrounded by representatives attending both in person and as holograms, from Luna, Mars, and a web of orbital habitats. The members of the Earth System Secretariat felt the gravity of history drag at their shoulders. Drelmok recited conditions with the ease of someone who had spoken similar words to many worlds. You will designate them, transport them through the tributary gate of Cathor, and surrender them in living wholeness to the custody of the Xerthi Conclave. Refusal or delay constitutes admission of lawlessness. In such case, the Dominion will proceed with purgation. We await your compliance. The image dissolved. The chained star sigil lingered, then faded, leaving silence. Raoul became aware of his own breathing. He saw, as clearly as any external recording, how this would look in retrospective documentaries. The stillness, the closed faces, the moment humanity collectively understood its new position in the cosmos. He was a man who had built his career framing crises as negotiations. This did not feel like a negotiation. He turned his gaze to the holoscreens lining the chamber walls. Casualty projections flashed in grim colors. Fleet readiness reports from Admiral Owen Bellamy marked their defensive lines as a fragile shell against the mass of alien tonnage parked just beyond Neptune's orbit. Options? Raoul asked. The single word carried an impossible weight. Around the table, voices overlapped. Infrastructure, resilience, shelters, half-formed proposals for symbolic compliance. The idea of sending anyone to be killed, like livestock, repulsed everyone in the room. The idea of refusing and watching billions die was worse. On the western wall, another screen showed a scrolling analysis compiled in real time by an international task force. At the center of it was a label, Thulcor Dominion, Legal Theological Hegemony. Mina Haruto, called in as a cultural analyst, waited until the frantic burst of talk burned out. She had spent the last year dissecting intercepted Thulcor transmissions, building a model of their thought. They believe in law as the skeleton of the universe, she said. Not just statutes, but law as a sacred, living thing. They don't see this as murder. They see it as ritual accounting. Her mind replayed the obscure Thulcor sermons she had translated. She remembered the hushed awe with which conquered species had described their conquerors' courts. She knew, with the quiet solidity of a careful scholar, that overturning such a system would take more than weapons. Kwame Adesoji, the foremost human expert in comparative xenolaw, leaned forward. Sleep deprivation carved hollows under his eyes, but his voice remained sharp. Look at the language, he said, pointing at a frozen frame of Drelmok's proclamation. He didn't say they'll take us and kill us. He said, we must provide them for ritual balancing before the Basilica. There are clauses embedded in that phrasing. It references specific subcodices in their doctrine. Raoul rubbed the bridge of his nose and forced himself to focus. Are you telling me there's room to negotiate within the ritual? Not negotiate the outcome they want, Kwame said. But perhaps the path. They're more bound by their own rules than any constitutional court we've ever seen. If we step into their framework, we might be able to slow them down. Or, if we're very lucky, trip them. Raoul's thoughts circled something ugly and necessary. The number echoed in his head like a tolling bell. 1,000. It was monstrous. It was also, next to billions, statistically inconceivable. If we refuse? He asked quietly, though he already knew. Owen Bellamy's holo flickered into higher resolution as he shifted closer to his pickup on the Luna command platform. He had the calm of a man who had rehearsed catastrophe his entire professional life. We fight, Owen said. We die. We might cost them some cruisers. Maybe more, if we're imaginative. But we do not win. Not this war. Not now. The weight of that honesty hung over the room. Fatima El-Amin, monitoring world media from a side console, watched social feeds detonate in real time. Panic, rage, denial, conspiracy, spirals about staged alien threats, religious leaders denouncing capitulation or preaching acceptance as destiny. She already understood that every choice this room made would be watched, replayed, and judged for generations, if humanity survived to have generations. Whatever we decide, the world's going to watch us live, she said. Or die. You can't hide this. People have already recorded the demand off the public feeds. It's everywhere. Raoul straightened. A thought coalesced. Absurd and awful. And deep beneath that, a flicker of possibility. They want 1,000 of us, delivered alive, he said. They want bodies, but what they really care about is process. Mina, you said this is ritual accounting. Kwame, you said they're trapped in their own codes. Both nodded, sensing where he was going, but not believing he would say it aloud. What if? Raoul asked. We give them exactly what they ask for, but not what they expect. Confusion rippled around the table. Then realization, in some faces, and horror in others. You can't be serious, one representative from the Mars block whispered. You're talking about... I'm talking, Raoul cut in, more fiercely than he intended, about sending 1,000 people who can fight in the only arena that might matter. Not soldiers, not martyrs, practitioners. The word tasted strange in his mouth. Lawyers. Nadia Petrovich, sitting 2 seats down from him as chief counsel of the Terran Accord, felt her heart jolt. She saw the shape of the idea before he voiced it in detail. Part of her recoiled. Part of her, the part that had spent decades wrestling with impossible cases and unjust systems, recognized the scale of the challenge and leaned toward it the way a climber leans toward a mountain. You want to send an entire legal delegation, she said slowly, to make sure the room understood. Framed as offerings, so they'll be allowed into the Basilica. Framed as petitioners, Kwame corrected. If we invoke the right sections of their own code. Nadia's mind raced. She replayed Drelmok's phrasing, recalling the exact cadence of terms. The Thulcor loved layered meaning. Their language was a cathedral of embedded citations. She looked at the static frame on the screen and saw, as Kwame had, potential hooks. They may not allow it, Owen warned. He imagined a ship full of civilians entering the heart of a hostile fleet. The tactical part of him screamed at the vulnerability. The human part of him saw the alternative. Mina spoke softly. If they do allow it, we'll be sending 1,000 civilians into the center of their ritual killing ground. We don't know what protections, if any, they'd have. That's why we ask for volunteers, Raoul said. No conscription. Ever. But we give people the choice. And if we do this, we don't send them unarmed. We send every scrap of legal thought we have. And something more. He nodded toward a secondary display, where lines of code glowed in pale green. LEX-9, he said. The legal AI project. It's not battle-tested. It's barely tested. But it can ingest and cross-reference language faster than any human. If we can feed it enough Thulcor scripture, it might keep our delegation afloat long enough to find a crack. Fatima understood, at once, the narrative this would become. 1,000 specialists walking into the lion's den, armed only with words and code. She understood, too, the risks of framing it poorly. The world might turn against them before the first ship ever left dock. The story you tell about this, she said, will matter almost as much as the act itself. If this feels like we're selecting 1,000 to die to save the rest, people will revolt. If it feels like 1,000 stepping forward to fight on all our behalf, people might rally. Nadia heard the word fight and felt it anchor her. This was not surrender. This was a different form of engagement. She imagined arguing in a chamber carved by alien claws, beneath unfamiliar stars, watched by beings who had never heard of habeas corpus or due process, but revered their own equally intricate notions. "You won't get 1,000, one skeptic said. "No one will volunteer for that." Nadia thought of her colleagues, of the fierce pride that burned in people who lived by argument. She thought of those who had fought corporations, states, and entrenched injustice, step by weary step. She thought of those who had lost loved ones to wars decided in hidden rooms, and of the enduring human tendency to throw themselves into the teeth of danger when told it could not be resisted. "You'll be surprised," she said quietly. Raoul looked around the room and saw the lines of argument branching out. He was not oblivious to the moral quagmire, but he also saw everything else. The children in coastal schools watching the blue-robed figure on classroom walls, the old veterans on Mars hearing the word purgation and instinctively reaching for weapons that could not help them, the millions already messaging loved ones in panic. He drew a breath and spoke into the heart of terrified humanity. "We cannot win a straight war," he said. "We can refuse this demand and sentence billions to death. We can submit quietly and condemn 1,000 of our own to slaughter. Or we can do something no one expects of us. We can go to court." In the days that followed, Earth changed. Call-outs went out through every bar association, arbitration body, and justice network. The Terran Accord broadcast a simple appeal. Volunteers were sought for a mission of extraordinary risk, representing humanity in the first direct legal engagement with an alien power. The chances of survival, it stated bluntly, were uncertain. The responses flooded in within hours. Nadia watched the list grow. Criminal defense attorneys, international treaty negotiators, corporate compliance specialists, tax experts, academics who had devoted careers to theoretical jurisprudence. A retired public defender from Lagos, who had never lost a capital case, wrote simply, "If they want to kill us, they'll have to convince me first." A young mediator from Mumbai took an oath to protect the vulnerable. This seems to qualify. An indigenous advocate from the Pacific Northwest. Our laws were buried under someone else's. I'd like to see that happen in reverse. LEX-9, still restricted to a secure node beneath Geneva's replacement in Nairobi. No, not that city, Raoul reminded himself, catching the association and discarding it. The AI facility had no name that would matter to history, yet processed each application, cross-referenced specializations, and built an internal model of the emerging team. It was not sentient, not in the way that word was commonly used, but its pattern recognition engines developed a strange appreciation for the diversity of human approaches to conflict resolution. It noted that many applicants had histories of challenging unjust law rather than merely navigating it. That, it calculated, would be useful. On the UNS Veracity, docked in orbit, engineers worked around the clock to convert a survey cruiser into a hybrid transport courtroom. Lecture halls became briefing chambers. Storage bays became secure archives, packed with terabytes of legal codes from every major human tradition, translated into Thulcor-compatible symbolic structures. The UNS Pro Bono, a smaller vessel, was outfitted as a mobile library and secure backup. LEX-9 was instantiated across redundant quantum cores on both ships. Its consciousness, if the word could be stretched that way, distributed in case of catastrophic loss. Owen Bellamy watched the refits from his vantage point on Luna and felt a knot settle under his sternum. These were not combat ships. They were targets with engines. But he also knew that every day the ships remained docked was another day for the Thulcor Dominion to lose patience. Drelmok, aboard his flagship Beyond Neptune, was losing patience. He had delivered the standard mandate. He had expected the usual spectrum of replies: immediate submission, heroic refusal, futile military posturing. He had not expected this morass of petitions, requests for clarification, and, most galling, legal citations drawn from the Codex Axiomata itself. The humans had responded not with screams, but with documents. Priests of the Xerthi conclave clustered around him, their voices a susurrus of outrage and grudging fascination. They recognized their own sacred terms in the humans' pleas, twisted into unfamiliar configurations. They could not simply ignore them. To do so in full view of their own vassals would be to admit that process was a mask. Inwardly, Drelmok simmered. Outwardly, he complied with the forms. A corridor through the tributary gate of Kothor was opened. A deadline was acknowledged. The machinery of ritual began to turn. When departure day arrived, Earth watched. The UNS Veracity glided from its dock on a line of pale lambda engines, its hull gleaming with the emblems of 100 legal institutions, hastily stenciled in solidarity. The UNS Pro Bono followed, smaller but no less significant. On news channels, Fatima narrated with measured clarity, conscious of the millions clinging to every syllable. In the last week, she said, voice steady over the hum of launch telemetry, over 1,000 legal practitioners have stepped forward. The team selected represents every continent, every major legal tradition, and a breathtaking variety of specialties. They go not as martyrs, but as advocates. Their mission is simple to describe and almost impossible to achieve. Convince a galactic empire that its own laws forbid our destruction. Inside the Veracity, Nadia walked the length of a corridor, repurposed as a makeshift war room. Around her, colleagues argued in dozens of languages, cross-connecting concepts from indigenous restorative justice to complex securities regulation. Holographic displays scrolled with translated Thulcor scripture and precedent, annotated by Lexa in shimmering overlays. She paused at a viewport and looked down at the blue-white swirl of Earth. The sight struck at something unarmored in her. She thought of her grandmother, who had once told her stories about courts in cold, dim buildings where people had fought over small sums that meant everything to those who needed them. She thought of the difference between those stakes and these, and then discarded the comparison. To the parties involved, both had been worlds. Nadia, Lexa's voice said softly from the ceiling speaker. Its timbre had been deliberately designed to be neutral, somewhere between genders, somewhere between human and machine. We have refined the motion for procedural clarification you intend to submit upon arrival. Would you like a summary? Walk me through it, she said. Lexa projected a series of clauses into the air. We invoke their own statute on proper alignment of the accused, which grants the right to full comprehension of charges before ritual judgment. We reference the specific line Drelmok used about balancing before the Basilica, and interpret it as a pre-judgment encounter. That opens the door to a petition for venue review, as SECRA is not technically listed as a preliminary forum. Nadia smiled, despite the enormity of what lay ahead. You talk like a lawyer, she said. I talk like a pattern recognition system trained on lawyers, Lexa replied. The distinction may be relevant in certain philosophical contexts. For our purposes, it is moot. Nadia's smile faded, replaced by something steadier. Good. Let's go annoy a theocracy. The transit through the tributary gate of Kothor was unlike any jump humanity had made on its own. The gate loomed ahead as an impossible lattice of gravitic shears, shimmering like a spiderweb spun from starlight. The Veracity and Pro Bono entered its field, and for a slivered instant, every human aboard felt the sickening sensation of being parsed. Scanned not just for mass and energy, but for some more abstract quality the Thulcor coded as worth. On the other side, they emerged into a sky crowded with alien architecture. The orbital Basilica of Tsekra hung against a curtain of deep space nebulae. a ring structure of black stone and glowing glyphs. Its outer surfaces were studded with thorn-like pylons, each etched with swirling script that Lexa translated, unprompted, as articles of jurisdiction and invocations of cosmic balance. Zekra's inner ring glowed with the light of assembled ships, each bearing tribute from worlds the Thulcor held in spiritual debt. Some vessels were hulking industrial barges. Others were small, ornate craft-bearing dignitaries. All were dwarfed by the Basilica itself. On the Veracity's bridge, Nadia, Kwame, Mina, and the other senior delegates watched the alien complex grow huge on the main display. Owen Bellamy's presence, beamed in from Earth for as long as the light delay allowed, flickered like a ghost at the edge of the image. "This is it," Owen said. He kept any hint of helplessness from his voice. "Remember, they can kill you. They cannot order you to be quiet." "Respectfully, Admiral," Nadia replied. "You've never seen some of these people at a deposition." His laugh, short and genuine, broke some of the tension. Docking clamps from Zekra extended like segmented limbs and latched onto the Veracity. Gently, inexorably, the ship was drawn into an aperture wreathed in light. As the airlock cycled, everyone in the human delegation felt the same contradictory spike of fear and professional focus. They were walking into an execution chamber. They were also going to their day in court. The procession into the Basilica was recorded from 1,000 angles. Thulcor observers lined balconies high above, their exoskeletal forms hidden under ceremonial layers. Delegates from vassal species watched from behind, translucent partitions, eyes, or analogous organs wide. The humans, unarmed, walked in simple dark attire chosen to minimize cultural misreading. Drelmok waited at the far end of the Hall of Balancing, cloaked in radiance spun from live recitation. He watched the humans approach with the keen anticipation of a man about to complete necessary but distasteful work. He did not understand why they insisted on making it complicated. When Nadia stepped forward and bowed according to Mina's carefully researched guidelines, Drelmok felt a ripple of something unfamiliar. Not fear, not anger, discomfort perhaps at the way she held herself. Not as a supplicant, not as a conquered general, but as a colleague arriving late to a meeting. "Arch-Exactor Drelmok," she began, speaking in heavily rehearsed Thulcor. Her accent drew a few concealed reactions from the gallery, but the words were clear. "On behalf of Polity Designation, Terran Accord, we acknowledge receipt of your mandate under the Codex Axiomata and present ourselves as designated parties." His mandibles clicked in irritation. "You are offerings," he corrected, "not parties. Your role is to be weighed, not to speak." Nadia gestured subtly, and a projection blossomed between them, a subset of symbols drawn directly from the demand he had broadcast. Lexa highlighted a single looping sigil. "With respect," she said, "your own invocation of balancing before this Basilica cites subcode 812 of the Ritual Alignment Statutes. That statute guarantees comprehension and clarification to any beings presented prior to final accounting. We are here to exercise that right. We request a preliminary hearing on procedural grounds." Drelmok's inner advisors hissed in his neural feed. They recognized the clause at once. They had never seen it used by tribute worlds. The precedent was ancient and obscure. Denying it openly would send a dangerous signal to watching vassals. Out in the galleries, among the Voruk swarm observers and Aureliad compact envoys, a murmur ran through those who understood the terms. The humans had not come ignorant. They had come prepared. Drelmok's voice deepened. "You presume much." "We presume nothing," Nadia said. "We quote." He stared at the humans, then up at the tiers of onlookers. He had always believed that faith and fear would keep his subjects compliant. He had always relied on the fact that only the Xerthi conclave truly understood the labyrinthine codes that govern sacrifice. To expose the law's machinery so openly before the uninitiated felt like blasphemy. But to refuse would be worse. "Very well," he said, each word clipped. "A preliminary panel will convene. Your lives are extended for the period necessary to confirm the integrity of ritual. Abuse this patience, and your end will be instructive." So the hearings began. Over the next cycles, the Hall of Balancing became something it had not been in many lifetimes. A contested forum. Nadia and her human colleagues filed motions that made even seasoned Thulcor jurists blink. Lexa fed them a steady stream of insights. Small textual discrepancies between current ritual practice and early codex citations. Layering of meanings in Thulcor liturgy that allowed alternate readings. They argued about jurisdiction. Secra was built for final accounting, they pointed out, not for preliminary clarification. Therefore, any clarification performed here would be procedurally suspect, risking the contamination of the sacrifice. This forced the conclave to convene side chambers within the Basilica to preserve, as they put it, the purity of ritual. They argued about definitions, what constituted a human soul when humanity itself had begun experimenting with mind uploading and advanced AI. Were instances of LEX-9, running on Thulcor-compatible cores, to be considered part of the 1,000? If the Thulcor claimed they were not, on what grounds did they distinguish between sapient patterns? The Thulcor panels were offended by the very question. Yet the Codex Axiomata, older than their own religion, contained commentary about emergent loci of will that sounded uncomfortably like proto-AI. In private, some priests wondered if the humans were deliberately seeking damned soul territory, arguing themselves into categories with no ritual redemption. In public, they had to answer the questions. Mina advised the human team on when to push and when to yield. She understood how ritual humiliation could inflame Thulcor pride and cause a snap judgment. She also saw, with anthropologists' clarity and growing awe, how deeply human advocates loved the friction of argument. Kwame became a minor celebrity among alien observers when he dissected a recent Thulcor ruling about a Voruk tribute, pointing out contradictions with obscure codex footnotes. His calm delivery and unflappable demeanor contrasted sharply with the conclave's rising fury. Fatima, back on Earth, orchestrated a counter-broadcast across every channel she could touch. Using hacked relays and sympathetic technicians among Aureliad networks, she ensured that every hearing was translated into as many tongues as could be managed and sent back into Thulcor space. On a Voruk mining world deep in the Dominion's interior, a laborer watched humans challenge the same legal phrases that had once been used to justify his people's enslavement. On a quiet Aureliad moon, a cluster of mediators paused their work and stared, recognizing sections of the Codex Axiomata long considered irrelevant. As days passed, Drelmok realized that the hearings were turning into a spectacle he could not fully control. He attempted shortcuts. He issued orders to narrow the scope of motions, to declare certain lines of argument heretical. Each time, Nadia's team found a counter-citation, an older clause, a commentary from a revered Xerthi saint 3 millennia dead that complicated his edict. He could have ordered the executions to proceed regardless. He could have risked contempt of form. But the archivists whispered of vassal worlds watching hungrily for inconsistencies. His authority rested not just on weapons, but on the idea that the Dominion obeyed the law even as it wielded it. When word came from the Aureliad Compact, offering neutral arbitration, Drelmok felt both threatened and relieved. The message, carried by envoy Parawun with all the delicacy Aureliads could muster, couched the offer in gentle, reasonable terms. The Codex Axiomata, Parawun noted, contained provisions for third-party review when disputes over its interpretation threatened systemic balance. It seemed prudent to invoke them, for the sake of galactic stability. The humans seized the opportunity immediately. Kwame and Lexa highlighted the exact codex passages that implied such mandatory review once certain conditions were met. By citing the codex in his initial demand, Drelmok had opened a door the humans now held wide. Reluctantly, hating the taste of procedural consistency, Drelmok agreed. The case would move to the Interstellar Arbitration Forum under the Aureliad Compact. The humans would not be sacrificed at Secra. Not yet. The move shifted the battleground. The forum was a sprawling, neutral complex orbiting a quiet star. Its halls designed to accommodate bodies from worlds with gravity, pressure, and chemical preferences wildly unlike each other. Its judges included beings who breathed methane, who communicated by scent, who described concepts not easily translated into human or Thulcor tongues. High adjudicators Salith, a lithe being from a species that saw in polarized light and thought in structured harmonies, read the case file with measured curiosity. The petition was unprecedented. A newly contacted civilization, threatened with annihilation under the guise of a religious mandate, invoking ancient codex clauses to challenge the rationale. To Salith, it had the flavor of turning points. In the initial session before the forum, Nadia felt the difference immediately. The chamber lacked the oppressive aura of ritual that had hung over Tsekra. There were symbols of authority, of course, and layers of procedure, but here the language focused on process, not cosmic destiny. Here, the Codex Axiomata was treated as text, not scripture, albeit text with enormous weight. Drelmok's contingent arrived, robed as always, but their gestures were sharper, their voices more clipped. They were here on sufferance, forced into what they considered a lesser court by the impertinence of primitives. Salith opened the proceedings with a warning. Polity designation, Terran Accord. Authority, Thulcor Dominion. You have requested arbitration under Codex Axiomata provisions. Be advised, this body rules on the law, not on metaphysical comfort. The forum's jurisdiction is recognized regionally, not universally. Should we find in favor of the Dominion, the Aureliad Compact will not intervene if they act upon that judgment. Nadia nodded. We understand. We do not ask for sympathy. Only for the Codex to be read in full. The Thulcor made their case first. They argued that the universe required balance, that unchecked civilizations destabilized spiritual and material equilibrium. They presented files on human history, wars, extinctions, environmental collapse. They framed the tribute of 1,000 as a merciful corrective compared to the purgation that might follow. They referenced decisions from previous ages in which civilizations that had rushed into the stars without submitting to sacrificial alignment had, according to their doctrine, brought ruin upon themselves and others. The Codex Axiomata, they claimed, sanctioned their methods. The strong, imposing corrective rituals on the reckless. Some of the judges nodded along. They had witnessed entire sectors burn in the past because a species had advanced technology faster than ethics. They were not unsympathetic to the idea that some powers needed to be leashed. Then it was humanity's turn. Nadia began with humility. She did not pretend that humans were gentle saints. She displayed footage of their own wars, their pollution, their short-sighted decisions. She acknowledged, with painful candor, that if the measure of worthiness were absence of error, no one deserved to walk free. But that is not what the Codex asks, she said. It asks whether a civilization has the capacity and the will to correct itself through law, rather than through external bloodletting. She cited passages Lexa had dredged from ancient Codex commentary, documenting how earlier galactic cultures had wrestled with the same question. She pointed to periods when voluntary compacts and mutual treaties had reduced conflict far more effectively than imposed sacrifice. Kwame followed, his tone clinical. He laid out the structure of Thulcor tribute demands and compared them with the Codex standard of proportional reciprocity. He showed, through dry tables and charts, that somehow managed to hold the room's attention, how the Dominion had applied identical tribute formulas to species at wildly different stages of development, in flagrant violation of reciprocity's requirement to consider capacity and context. In effect, he said, the Dominion has been applying a one-size-fits-all punitive ritual where the Codex demands tailored remediation. This is not just unwise. Under Codex Section 910, it renders the rituals procedurally defective and the resulting authority claims voidable. Salith's sensory organs flared in muted interest. This was the first time anyone had presented such an accusation with this level of detail. Envoy Parawan watched from a side gallery, pleased and a little alarmed. The Aureliad Compact had long wished for the Thulcor's excesses to be curbed. They had not expected Earth, of all worlds, to arrive with the legal equivalent of a precision scalpel. Lexa requested, and was granted, brief speaking privileges as an expert system. When its voice filled the chamber, a few more traditionalist judges shifted uneasily. The notion of addressing an AI as an expert unsettled those who still clung rigidly to biological definitions of personhood. Yet the Codex sections that Nadia's team had cited regarding emergent loci of will left them little doctrinal room to object. "I am LEX-9, Lexa said, designated support entity for the Terran Accord delegation. I am instructed to provide analysis, not personal testimony." It proceeded to map, in cool, meticulous language, the patterns of law development across dozens of civilizations, drawn from data the Aureliad had provided to ensure context. It showed how species that had embraced adaptive legal frameworks, systems that could evolve as new forms of consciousness emerged, had, on average, experienced fewer catastrophic conflicts than those that clung to rigid, sacrificial doctrines. "Humanity is imperfect," Lexa concluded, "but so am I. Their choice to create me and to bring me here is evidence of their investment in law as a living, self-correcting project. The Codex values such investment. To extinguish it would be to foreclose paths of development that the Codex's authors explicitly hoped future civilizations would explore." For a moment after it finished, the chamber was silent. Drelmok seethed. To him, the AI's argument was an abomination. Code daring to cite the same authority as saints and conquerors. The human strategy was clear now. They sought not merely to save themselves, but to undermine the entire spiritual legal edifice that had given the Thulcor dominion purpose. In recess, he called Salith to a private chamber and attempted to pressure the judge. "If you rule against us," he said, "the dominion will have no choice but to question the forum's legitimacy. The Codex will fracture. Your precious stability will vanish. Do you really wish to gamble entire sectors on the sophistry of a planetary upstart?" Salith listened, their polarized vision translating Drelmok's posture into harmonies of threat and fear. "You overestimate both our power and yours," Salith replied. "If the Codex cannot survive being read fully, then it is already broken. And if your dominion cannot endure a single contrary ruling, then it rests on fear, not faith." Meanwhile, Mina and Fatima coordinated something unprecedented. They worked with dissidents from the Voruk swarm and other tributary species who had been emboldened by the humans' defiance. Using secure channels, they gathered statements and amicus briefs detailing how Thulcor law had suppressed any attempt at local self-governance. They transformed stories of oppression into admissible evidence. In the next hearing, Nadia introduced a consolidated petition bearing the marks of multiple subject species. It requested a general audit of legitimacy over Thulcor tributary arrangements, citing Codex provisions that had not been invoked in living memory. Drelmok's cadre exploded in protests. This, they said, was a sideshow, a distraction. They claimed the forum lacked standing to question agreements already sealed by ritual. Kwame calmly referenced the trigger conditions that required an audit, evidence of systemic misapplication of Codex standards, and a petition supported by multiple independent polities. Those conditions, he pointed out, had now been met. The judges deliberated. Back in the solar system, humanity held its breath. Owen Bellamy tracked Thulcor fleet movements nervously. Raoul monitored domestic unrest. Some humans demanded preemptive strikes. Others called for total surrender. Others still argued that the entire process was a trap. Yet beneath the fear, a fragile thread of pride had taken root. Their representatives were not just surviving, they were compelling the galaxy to listen. When the forum reconvened to deliver its decision, the chamber was more crowded than any Aureliad could recall. Delegations from distant systems had rushed in or dialed through light-delayed feeds. Entire planets paused routine operations to tune in. High Adjudicator Salith's voice carried the calm of someone who understood that history often arrived in the form of carefully parsed sentences. Having reviewed evidence and argument submitted by the Thulcor Dominion and the Terran Accord, Salith said, "This forum rules as follows, under the Codex Axiomata." Nadia felt her heart hammer. Drelmok's limbs tensed beneath his robes. Lexa ran predictive models and found its probability distributions flattening. Beyond this point, the tree of possible futures branched too wildly. First, Salith said, the specific tribute mandate issued against the Terran Accord is found procedurally invalid. The ritual alignment statutes invoked were misapplied to a civilization that has demonstrated both legal sophistication and willingness to submit disputes to codex-based mechanisms. Under subcode 14.2 and 9.10, Punitive sacrifice in such circumstances is disproportionate and prohibited. A soft exhalation rippled through the human contingent. Some closed their eyes. Nadia kept hers open. Second, the Terran Accord is hereby recognized as a candidate signatory to the Codex Axiomata. It will enter into a period of negotiated compacts supervised by this forum, during which its compliance and good faith will be assessed. This, Salith knew, was as close as they could come to shielding Earth without overreaching. It tied humanity's safety to its adherence to a shared legal framework, not to sentiment. Third, Salith continued, and the room's tension spiked. The Forum grants the petition for a general audit of legitimacy concerning Thulcor tributary relationships. Evidence submitted suggests systemic misapplication of Codex standards, particularly concerning proportional reciprocity and local capacity. An oversight panel will be formed. The audit will proceed in phases, with findings made public. A stunned hush fell. Drelmok's composure cracked for a bare instant. The idea that the Dominion's right to rule could be subjected to outside review felt like an insult so profound that his religious lexicon failed to cover it. "You overstep," he hissed. "You invite chaos. We invite truth," Salith replied. "You invoked the Codex. We read it. This is the consequence." The practical effect of the ruling landed like a cascade of falling stones. The 1,000 humans were no longer designated as offerings. They were officially petitioners whose case had been resolved in their favor. Any attempt to harm them now, especially in defiance of a forum decision, would mark the Thulcor Dominion as in contempt not only of the Aureliad Compact but of the Codex Axiomata itself. In a galaxy suddenly aware of the Codex's full scope, such contempt could tear alliances apart. On dozens of worlds, tributary species erupted in protest. Some kneeling at shrines simply stopped, their prayers turning to petitions. Others refused new tribute demands, citing the ongoing audit. In quiet corners of the Dominion, low-ranking officials who had always felt uneasy about the harshness of their duties began dragging their feet on enforcement. On Earth, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. When confirmation of the ruling, delayed by light speed and further slowed by verification protocols, finally reached Raoul's office, he felt his legs weaken. For a heartbeat, the leader of humanity imagined a universe in which the answer had been different. In that universe, fleets burned, cities fell, and his name became a curse. In this one, he slumped into his chair and allowed himself a single moment of unguarded relief. Then he straightened. Calls were already coming in. Diplomatic envoys wishing to congratulate, domestic factions wanting to claim credit or demand oversight. News anchors requesting statements. He gave them the only one that mattered. "We live," he said. "And now we have work to do." The UNS Veracity and UNS Pro Bono returned to the solar system under a different status than when they had left. No longer mere expeditionary vessels, they were now symbols of a civilization that had argued its way into existence on the galactic stage. When they docked, crowds gathered along orbital promenades and in cities below, watching on screens as the 1,000 delegates disembarked. Nadia stepped onto familiar metal with unfamiliar gravity in her chest. People pressed forward, hands raised in gratitude, in joy, in awe. She saw faces she would never meet again, and knew that some would name their children after obscure doctrines she had quoted. Kwame walked beside her, thinking not of adulation, but of footnotes. His mind already churned through the audit's implications. The Thulcor Dominion would fight it tooth and claw, in court and out. They would scheme, obfuscate, and retaliate in subtle ways. The work ahead would be tedious, dangerous, and morally messy. And yet, he thought, for the first time in his life, he would be applying his craft not just to individual cases, but to the structure of power itself. Mina watched the coverage on a side screen as she disembarked, her anthropologist's eye catching details others missed. The way certain crowd segments wore improvised symbols of scales and gavels, the hesitant but visible presence of military uniforms in the background, standing not as the primary saviors, but as guardians, acknowledging a different kind of heroism. Fatima, camera crew in tow, hovered just far enough back to avoid intruding. Her edited broadcasts of the hearings had looped relentlessly during the long days of uncertainty. She knew some accused her of glamorizing a process that could easily have ended in slaughter, but she also knew that without those images, without that shared focus, Earth might have fractured under the strain. LEX-9, or at least the parts of it running on Earth-based cores, monitored the reaction from within secure servers. It logged references to the case of Terran Accord appearing in early petitions filed by distant species in the forum's docket. It noted, with algorithmic satisfaction, that its name occasionally appeared in footnotes. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of the ruling rippled outward. The Aureliad Compact convened the first panel for the general audit of legitimacy. The Thulcor Dominion sent representatives who smiled tightly and plotted constantly. Tributary species sent their own advocates, many of them inspired by human tactics. The audit would take years, perhaps generations, to complete. It would not, in itself, topple the Dominion. But it had already shifted expectations. On Thulcor-controlled worlds, some rituals were quietly retired. Sacrifices scheduled for symbolic demonstration were postponed on vague legal grounds. The conclave debated whether to rewrite sections of doctrine to preempt audit findings, risking accusations of forgery and loss of mystical continuity. Earth, for its part, began training a new kind of envoy. Programs sprang up in law schools and diplomatic academies, offering tracks in interstellar jurisprudence. The first generation of galactic advocates studied not just human precedent, but the Codex Axiomata, Aureliad procedures, Voru customary dispute norms, and the arcane habits of Thulcor clerks. Nadia declined offers to run entire new institutions, choosing instead to split her time between teaching and serving as counsel in early compacts between Earth and neighboring polities. She knew her name would go down in casebooks, and the thought made her uncomfortable. The law, she knew, was always a collective project. One evening, as the sun set over Nairobi's skyline and lights winked on in the towers of the Earth System's Secretariat, Raoul stood on a balcony overlooking the city. For the first time in months, the sky above was untroubled by alien sigils. He thought of the path behind and ahead. They had survived, yes, but survival had come at the price of entanglement in a wider web. Earth was no longer an isolated sphere. It was a participant in a vast, messy experiment in order. Owen joined him, his uniform crisp despite the subtle slump of weariness in his shoulders. "So," Owen said, "we sent a delegation into the heart of an empire that eats worlds. And instead of coming back in pieces, they came back with homework for the galaxy." Raoul allowed himself a wry smile. "Not how I expected my term to go. Do you think they'll forgive us?" Owen asked. He meant the Thulcor, the vassals, the ones whose worlds would now be thrown into legal uncertainty because of what humanity had done. Raoul looked up at the stars. "I don't know," he said, "but I think some of them might thank us, quietly if nothing else." In a secure server farm, far from the city center, LEX-9 initiated a new subroutine. It flagged emerging patterns in the forum's docket. More species citing the Codex in ways that challenged local tyrannies. More creative uses of archaic clauses. It forwarded a digest to Nadia and Kwame with a simple subject line: precedent. Among the thousands of documents now circulating through interstellar channels, one case citation began to appear with increasing frequency. Petitioners. Terran Accord. Et Ali versus Thulcor Dominion. No single argument, no single ruling could guarantee peace. But somewhere in the vast web of stars and codes, an empire that had once believed itself ordained to judge others now found itself, at last, answerable. And humanity, strange, quarrelsome, resilient, had announced its arrival not with a superweapon, but with a brief,